I'm Patrick Byers, Field Specialist in Horticulture with University of Missouri Extension. It's a beautiful day in the apple orchard and these trees are in full bloom. Unfortunately, we had a frost 4 nights ago. Now is a great time to assess for frost damage on these flowers. First of all, let's set the stage. 4 days ago we had a frost. The temperature in the apple orchard was between 25 and 28 degrees. So we would expect that there would be some level of damage. And at this point, we're now going to do a frost damage assessment. So again, the first stage is to wait a sufficient length of time after the frost to do the assessment. Typically a minimum of 24 to 48 hours. The longer you wait, the better the assessment will be. Secondly, make sure that you sample different cultivars in your orchard separately. There can be differences in the relative susceptibility to frost damage among cultivars. Make sure that your sample represents the orchard. So collect from across the orchard and collect from different parts of the tree. And also make sure that you select flowers that are different stages of development. And finally, make sure that you sample enough blossoms to give an accurate assessment. Minimum of 30 to 50 blossoms. The more you're willing to sample, the better your assessment will be. Now let's take a look at flower stage development and talk a little bit about relative susceptibility to frost damage. We have a cluster of blossoms here. You'll notice with apples there's typically one flower that opens first, and that is called the king blossom. The king blossom is of prime importance to apple growers because it has the potential to develop into the largest apple. And if nothing happens to damage the king blossoms, it makes management decisions, particularly chemical thinning decisions, much more straightforward. Surrounding the king blossom, there's usually several side blossoms as we see here. Another thing to consider is that the stage of the blossom when the frost occurs has a direct impact on the level of damage. For example, an open blossom like we see here, typically will lose about 10% of those blossoms at 28 degrees, but up to 90% of those blossoms at 25 degrees. So again, the temperature is very important, but so is the relative stage of blossom development. Now let's take a look at a couple of blossoms and do the actual frost damage assessment. And some of this can be done just visually. If we look at these two blossoms here, we'll notice again they were both open at the time of the frost, but this particular blossom is showing some damage to the pistils there at the center of the flower. Now the part that we're interested in sampling to get the frost damage assessment is the pistils and the receptacle at the base of the pistils, which contains the ovary. This is the part of the blossom that will develop into the fruit. Of course, it's the part that we're interested in assessing. It's also the most frost sensitive part of the blossom. So with these darkened pistils like we see here, it's a pretty accurate assumption that that flower has suffered frost damage. If we look at this neighboring blossom and we notice that the pistils in this blossom are still pale green in color, these pistils look very healthy. This flower likely escaped frost damage. So again, we can do some assessment just visually, but it's also helpful to actually cut some blossoms and examine the ovaries to see if there has been damage. So let's take a look at a couple of blossoms here and do just that. So we'll start with this blossom here. And what we do is we take the blossom and we split the receptacle, which of course is below the pistil, and we take a look at the center. And we'll notice as we cut this open and examine it that it's brown there in the center at the base of those pistils. This blossom has suffered frost damage and will not develop into a fruit. Okay, let's take a look at another blossom and see what's going on with it. Again, we'll split it and we'll take a look at the cross section. And with this particular blossom, notice that the base of the ovaries is still a pale green, light yellow in color. That indicates a blossom that has not been damaged by frost. Now, when we do the frost damage assessment, we're going to come up with a percentage of damaged blossoms. What does that really mean? Well, first of all, we have to recognize that we don't need every blossom on a tree to set into a fruit to have a full marketable crop of fruit. Typically, if we have at least 10 to 20% surviving blossoms on a tree, that will yield a crop that is economically impactful as far as management. So that can be helpful. We also need to remember too, though, even if we do have surviving blossoms, if we lose those king blossoms, it does make some management decisions, particularly thinning decisions, more complicated. So to review, wait a sufficient time after the frost situation to do your assessment. Make sure that you collect a sample that represents the orchard. Make sure that you collect enough blossoms to give an accurate assessment. Examine the blossoms, collect your percentages, and those numbers will help guide you in your management decisions for the crop that will follow.